Rome was ambitious. It wanted to become a great city and reach the pinnacle of accomplishment. And it was so efficient and successful in this endeavor that it served as a model and an inspiration for the founding of the rest of the cities in the empire. Roman progress and well-being was more powerful than all the victories on the battlefield. This was probably the most powerful Romanization weapon that ever existed. The decision to found a city and where to locate it depended on military, logistical, and commercial strategies. But the exact site depended on a wide range of determining factors. Here are the basic principles for founding a city. First, a highly favorable piece of land must be chosen. High, open ground, clear of mist and fog, and with an orientation that should neither be hot or cold, but temperate. Proximity to swamps should also be avoided. That is how Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, a Roman architect and essayist, describes in his essay on architecture the factors that should be taken into account when choosing the site for a city. He takes into consideration a multitude of factors. For example, he says the city's grid must be laid out according to the cardinal points, but that this orientation should be altered according to the direction of the prevailing winds. And so he continues with many details, including the orientation with respect to the sun, the alternative layout of the grid depending on whether it was an inland or a coastal city, mountainous, or other. But for the Romans, there was one critical and determining factor above all others, and that was water. The Romans knew that water was a fundamental element for progress and well-being, and that it had to reach the heart of the city in abundant amounts. Caius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, a Roman writer, scientist, naturalist, and soldier, better known as Pliny the Elder, could not have been more explicit and categorical when he stated, "It is the water that makes the city." It was inconceivable that a town or city, no matter how small, would not have drinking water and public baths. But where to find abundant flows of water whose cleanliness could be guaranteed? Wells offered good quality water, but not a constant flow. Rivers may have had a good flow, but they did not offer the hygienic conditions demanded by the Romans. And the same was true of lakes and dams. The water from these places could easily become contaminated. Rainwater could be stored but not drunk, because standing water ended up becoming a source of disease. There was only one possible solution: to collect water from the powerful and copious springs far up in the mountains. Therefore, before founding a city and choosing its definitive site, it was fundamental to verify where there were springs that were sufficiently powerful and constant that they could guarantee an uninterrupted supply of good water to the population, whatever the climate or the season. and it was necessary to determine, given the distance and altitude of the water source they found, whether it was feasible to channel it to the desired city site by building one or several aqueducts. Only when all this had been verified could the site to build the city be confirmed. With the site confirmed, they proceeded to mark out the land boundaries using a ritual the Romans had inherited from the Etruscans. An augur confirmed whether the place was favorable to the gods. In any event, the augur confirmed the site already chosen by the engineers. The next step was the inauguratio. At a central point in the chosen area, a pit was dug, and in it offerings and soil from the founder's place of origin were placed. Then the city perimeter was marked out using a plough pulled by a team of oxen guided by a priest. The city's defensive wall would be built on this perimeter. Next, a mensor calculated and marked out the zones inside this area. Finally, a priest officiated at the consecration with a sacrifice in honor of the Capitoline Triad, the gods Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. The Roman city was normally organized around two main axes. The Cardo, or Cardos Maximus, the street that ran roughly from north to south, and the Decumanus Maximus, the street perpendicular to it that crossed the city from east to west. The rest of the streets were laid out in parallel to these, forming the city blocks. The heart of the city was the Forum. This was a large porticoed plaza, normally rectangular in shape, where the main public buildings were found. These were the curia, or seat of the local senate, the basilicas or civil buildings where public procedures and commercial operations took place, and the temples, especially those dedicated to the Capitoline Triad. In the vicinity of the Forum were the markets, and beyond them the public buildings dedicated to leisure and spectacles, such as the baths, the circus, the amphitheatre, and the theatre. This was the ideal model of a Roman city. It had been inherited from the Greek hippodamic model. This model can be easily confirmed from satellite images of the many cities that have managed to maintain their imprint on the territory. For example, in Miletus, a city of Greek origin whose rectangular layout was planned by Hippodamus of Miletus and became the archetype of urban design that would be followed in the classical cities. Or in Timgad, also known as Tamugadi in Algeria, a Roman colonia. All perfectly visible are the walled perimeter, the Cardo Maximus, the Decumanus Maximus, the Forum in the heart of the city, and not far away, the theatre. But the ideal model could be modified. We can see this in many cities. For example, Pompeii in Italy. This city developed without a clearly hippodamic grid. Also in Palmyra in Syria, a city of Nabatean origin, Queen Zenobia's capital that was finally conquered and extensively Romanized. It has magnificent columned avenues, but its perimeter is highly irregular, and its urban layout has no clearly quadrangular structure. But sometimes the model could be altered considerably. Quicul, a Roman colonia in Algeria, is a good example. Or Cyrene, a Greek colony in Libya, which is laid out along a major street in the fortified settlement. Or Ephesus, of Greek origin and much altered by Rome, without perpendicular avenues, but with a large main street and an enormous porticoed avenue leading to the port. Most Roman cities were colossal projects that covered huge areas. But over the last 2,000 years, all these cities have suffered natural catastrophes, pillaging, or premeditated destruction. Many of them have been practically erased from our present. Despite this, important remains have managed to survive until our time. But it just so happens that the sites chosen by the Romans for some of their cities were so perfect and advantageous that after the decline of the empire, new cities were built in exactly the same place. Some of these cities have survived to the present day and are the result of more than 2,000 years of urban evolution. Today, these cities are marvelous archaeological sites. In them, the interpretation of the ancient Roman remains is an enormous and exciting challenge. The year 218 before Christ. The Carthaginian army under the command of the general Hannibal Barca began a major campaign against Rome. He decided to march through Iberia and southern Gaul. His objective was to cross the Alps and head directly to Rome. With the aim of cutting off the Carthaginian army's supply lines, the Romans decided to disembark in ancient Iberia. It was essential that they cut supplies and communications between Hannibal and his rear guard in order to isolate him. To do this, they needed to find a strategic military emplacement on the Mediterranean coast. General Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio was in charge of the Roman legions that had the mission of finding this ideal place. And they found it on a coastal hill overlooking a bay suitable for a port. There they set up their camp, and later a city was built. That was the beginning of Tarraco, Rome's port in Hispania. These obvious advantages for the siting of a city have continued over the centuries, and the result is Tarragona, a pleasant and prosperous city on the Spanish Mediterranean coast. Tarragona, which inherited its name from the ancient Tarraco, is one of those modern metropolises built over multiple ancient cities. A stroll through Tarragona is a very special experience. The fact that Tarragona occupies exactly the same site as ancient Tarraco means that history greets you with each step you take. In the following minutes, we'll witness a grand spectacle in which we'll come to understand the grandeur and splendor that is hidden behind each of these stones. Archaeological excavations carried out in the city centre revealed these remains. They are 2 rows of 14 columns. Thanks to better preserved remains in other cities, we know that these are the ruins of a basilica. It was a large building with 3 naves. The central nave was higher than the lateral naves, providing light for the interior. This was the judicial basilica, the place where legal matters such as contracts and trials were dealt with. It was also a place for imperial worship. The building was in the heart of the city, in the local forum. This forum also had a square of approximately 58 by 52 meters, surrounded by a portico some 6 meters wide. This was the most important commercial zone of Tarraco. The excavations also revealed evidence of the proximity of a capital, the city's main temple some 2,100 years ago, dedicated to the gods Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. If we compare what we have just learned with the situation today, we can quickly see that present-day Tarragona would find it difficult to compete in grandeur and splendor with ancient Tarraco. In the north of Tarragona, we find a quiet, pleasant park known as the Camp de Mart, or Field of Mars. This is a place that takes you back to the past and offers you paths to walk through history in silent reflection. The park is located at the foot of the ancient Roman walls of Tarraco. These walls are exceptional for several reasons. Firstly, because they're the earliest Roman construction preserved outside Italy. Secondly, because despite their age, they are the best preserved examples in the world. Following their design, the first 3 meters above the ground were built with megaliths that served to reinforce them against the impact of war machines, and also made excellent foundations. You can't help but be impressed by these tremendous blocks of stone and wonder how they were transported and put into place. Some of them must weigh over 30 tons. The upper part of the wall is made of well-fitted, regular ashlars, laid without mortar. This is the technique known as opus quadratum. Many of these ashlars have marks carved on them that recall similar constructions in Italy. Let's look at the building technique. The base of the wall is some 5 meters wide. On either side were the megaliths, and the interior was filled with large stones and earth. Next, the ashlars were placed. They were finely cut, perfectly fitted and bonded without mortar. Every few meters, others were placed transversely to form interior walls. This technique provided an internal structure that considerably reinforced and increased the strength of the wall. Independent compartments were also built, so that in the case of a breach, the rest of the wall could be protected. The interior was initially filled with small stones and small pieces of rubble. This fill was covered by layers of adobe of some 10 by 30 by 45 centimeters. The total height of the wall was 10 or 12 meters, and its width at the top was around 4 meters. Enough room for a guard area known as the patrol path. Towers were built at carefully calculated distances. They housed soldiers, sometimes armed with scorpions, whose mission was to defend the wall. The distance between these towers was normally determined by the range of weapons. On the inside, sloping ramps allowed the men and war machinery to be moved quickly and efficiently to the top of the walls. Today, the preserved part of the Tarragona wall only partially protects the old quarter. But it once surrounded the whole perimeter of the city, some 5 kilometers. The adaptation of Tarragona to a sloping terrain and its coastal location conditioned its layout, clearly making it one of those cities that diverged from the ideal Roman model. Another factor was that it was such an important city, the capital of a province. Tarragona is a very hospitable city with a wonderful Mediterranean climate. It seems that this was also true 2,000 years ago, as the ancient texts tell us that the people of Tarragona were cordial, and its climate was that of an eternal spring. Thus, Tarragona had a large population, a major trading infrastructure, and many visitors, and the size of its entertainment venues was in keeping with its prestigious position. At the eastern end of this street today, we find the remains of Tarragona's medieval wall. For a long time, right up to the modern period, this sector of the city was occupied by military fortifications that took advantage of the Roman ruins, fortunately without seriously damaging them. So it is behind these walls we have a pleasant surprise. Here we have the only 3 surviving arches of the 55 that made up the facade of the circus. They are 7 meters high. Truly impressive. We can see that the facade was built with meticulously worked ashlars. In the interior there were smaller hewn stone blocks, and we can see that the vaults were built with the famous Roman concrete. These arches were normally closed with grills and would have been opened to allow the public in when an event was being staged. These vaulted spaces had different uses. This specific one had a stairs that led to the upper seating. From this point, we can see the remaining arches. And from here, we have the foundations of those that have not survived. We would find a few more of these foundations if we dug up this street, and a lot more under those houses. There we can clearly see the outline of the seating. This is the Plaza de la Font, an attractive square full of cafe terraces popular with locals and tourists. At one end, we can see Tarragona's City Hall. Chariots once raced where the people now sit to have a coffee. In other words, we're standing in the circus arena. This square occupies approximately 20% of what was once the area of the circus. That will give you an idea of the original size of this enormous building. The houses on the southern side of the square were built on Roman foundations, and their width was conditioned by the original vaults of the circus. That is why they're all of a similar size. Many of these houses not only still have the Roman foundations, they also reused many of the walls and the vaults. Let's go into this bank branch, where we can see clearly what we're talking about. Here we can see that these premises have inherited the hollow of a vault. Specifically, it's number 28 on the circus facade. The bank had the good judgment and taste to respect all this when fitting out its new branch. And on the wall, they've drawn the outline of the seating, educational and attractive. And the same is true of many of these premises and houses, most of which are privately owned. Very close by in the square known as Plaza dels Sadassos, other excavations have revealed new and illuminating remains of the circus. We're in the front of the northern stands. Here there was a wall of ashlars. That's where the seating began. And therefore down there would have been the level of the arena. We can also see part of the vaults that supported the seating. And how the houses in the street above were built on them. Now we can see more clearly than ever how the builders of the houses took advantage of the Roman foundations. This is a passageway that ran along the whole northern part of the circus, parallel to and below the stands. Originally, it must have run the whole length of the circus, but now only a third of it remains. Taking advantage of the spaces in the vaults, there would have been dozens of rooms used as storage for the operations and logistics of the circus. We can see how a huge amount of Roman concrete was used in its construction. It had to be very strong, as it had to support the weight of thousands of spectators. Tarako's circus was an impressive building, some 310 meters long and between 100 and 115 meters wide. The arena was divided by a broad wall, the Eripos or Spina, which was decorated with statues and other architectural elements. It had a capacity of around 23,000 spectators. It was used to hold the ludi circenses, especially chariot races. There was a large tower at each end of the circus. The eastern tower is still standing, known today as the Praetorian Tower. It has been much altered with different reconstructions over the centuries. It affords impressive views of the city of Tarragona, and we can get an idea of the former grandeur of the Roman circus of Tarraco. We are now in the Praetorium Tower. Here at the bottom, we have important clues as to how the city continued in the upper part of the circus. On this original Roman wall, we have a decoration of pilasters. And down here, an indication of the true level of the foundations. Linking this information to that from other finds and our knowledge of cities in other parts of the empire, we can reconstruct the building complex to which it belongs, the Plaza of Representation and the provincial administration. It is a massive square, perhaps the second largest in the entire Roman Empire. It was 265 meters long and 145 meters wide. The buildings around the perimeter housed the provincial administration, archives, treasury, meeting rooms, and other accommodations. The interior of the square would almost certainly have been decorated with gardens, fountains, honorific inscriptions, and numerous statues. There was a monumental stairway on the northeastern side. A stairway approximately in the same position as this one. Today, these steps lead to this square, in front of Tarragona Cathedral. In the time of Tarraco, this was the imperial worship area. Another large square, this one 156 by 133 meters. In the middle, coinciding roughly with the position of the cathedral today, was the temple dedicated to the cult of the emperor and built in honor of Augustus. Today, we have quite a good idea of what the upper part of Tarraco would have looked like. What made up the monumental seat of the provincial council, the most prestigious area in the city. This whole area, covering more than 18 hectares, is today occupied by the old quarter of Tarragona. The upper part of Tarraco was reserved for the city's political and economic elite. Now it is occupied by the urban center of Tarragona. Therefore, 2,000 years ago, exactly on this spot, you would have seen Roman politicians strolling among luxuriant gardens with fountains and marble statues. It's impossible not to wonder about the fate of the enormous, opulent structures that once stood here. In many of the houses, most of which are a little more than a century old, we find clues that could help solve the mystery. Ancient statue pedestals with their original Latin inscriptions that have been used as common building materials. The Roman ruins of the upper part of Tarraco were a source of building material for more than 1,500 years and up until very recently. The remains of Tarraco are so fragmented that meticulous research has been needed to interpret them, as they themselves cannot bear witness to what they once were. However, there is one splendid exception, the amphitheatre. Enough has been preserved of Tarragona's amphitheatre to give us a good idea of its former glory. Various restorations have also helped. The Roman technicians took advantage of the slope of the promontory to cut part of the seating into it. In the areas where the terrain did not allow this, the stands were built on vaults. The structure that stands out in the arena is the remains of a 6th century basilica and a 12th century Romanesque church. Both the basilica and the church were built with stone blocks from the amphitheatre itself. Therefore, these remains do not belong to the original construction. This was the site of the tribune. It is a large vault that would have been profusely decorated and was reserved for the authorities who presided over the games. We can see how the pits cross transversely and longitudinally the arena. They would originally have been covered with wooden planks. In them were the places of rest and worship, where the gladiators invoked the protector goddess Nemesis. The Porta Triumphalis was a large gate to the arena through which the gladiators entered in a solemn procession. The other gate was the Porta Libitinaria, through which those vanquished in combat exited. Enormous masts supported and tautened an ingenious system of ropes, designed to open and close a huge awning, the velarium. Its mission was to protect the spectators from the sun on hot days. This amphitheatre could hold approximately 12,000 spectators. The most representative of the spectacles held in the amphitheatres were the gladiator combats and simulated wild animal hunts. In contrast to the movie image of fights to the death, being a gladiator was a lucrative and long-lasting occupation during most of the imperial period. Many gladiators had families, and they certainly did not give their lives in the arena. The vestiges discovered of Tarraco's amphitheatre and Roman circus have been important and have shed much light on what these buildings were once like. However, there's one more entertainment venue we have to see, Tarraco's theatre. Unfortunately, all that remains of it are the foundations and part of the first 5 rows of seating. To imagine what Tarraco's theatre would have been like, we have to go to another part of the empire. To a city similar to Tarraco, whose Roman theatre has survived in better condition. The year 209 before Christ. Rome, at the hand of General Scipio, had succeeded in cutting off Hannibal's supply lines, but he only controlled the northeastern coast of Iberia. Scipio's army was far outnumbered by that of the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal Barca stationed in the south of Hispania. This worried Rome and demoralized its troops. But without having received any orders from Rome, General Scipio unexpectedly decided to invade Carthaginian Iberia. His strategy was to carry out a lightning attack on Carthagena, the Carthaginian capital in Iberia. The Roman fleet transported the army's heaviest equipment by sea, allowing the infantry to advance at great speed. Carthagena fell to the Romans and was renamed Carthago Nova. Carthago Nova became one of the capitals of Roman Hispania, together with Tarago and Corduba. Like Tarago, Carthago Nova's location was so advantageous that over the centuries, the city has remained on the same site. Today, it is the Spanish city of Cartagena. In ancient times, the location of Cartagena was a peninsula in the middle of a bay anchorage ideal for the ships. It was a large natural port surrounded by hills that made it easy to defend. It was a privileged location that was quickly chosen by the Carthaginians. Ever since then, it has been a strategic and military emplacement, making present-day Cartagena a melting pot of many epochs and cultures, and an important cultural and tourism center. The most impressive ancient monument the city preserves from all its centuries of history is the Roman theatre of Carthago Nova. Its remains have been masterfully integrated into the urban fabric of present-day Cartagena, providing the city with a magnificent museum space. The museum has been brilliantly conceived, offering in its final room a tour of the theatre itself. All these remains and the preserved structure of the Roman theatre of Cartagena are sufficient to allow us to imagine what it must have looked like in ancient times. The plays were performed on the proscenium. Below was the orchestra, a semicircle reserved for the authorities and musicians. Surrounding all this was the cavea, a semicircular structure with the seating. Enclosing the space was a spectacular backdrop, consisting of a double order of marble columns more than 16 meters high. As in the amphitheaters, a velarium could be unfurled to protect the spectators from the sun. Behind the Essenae fronts, there was a large area of gardens. According to Vitruvius, this was where the spectators sheltered in the event of unexpected rain, and also where the actors prepared for the performance. Roman theatres were emblematic buildings in which classical and Roman works were performed. Their main purpose, like that of the other entertainment venues, was to entertain the citizens. The cavea of the Roman theatre of Carthago Nova could seat 6,000 spectators in strict order of social rank.
Carthago Nova
The city of Cartagonova was very similar to Taraco in importance and population. And the ground plan of Tarragona's Roman theatre is very similar to that of Cartagena. Therefore, despite our lack of information, we can venture to reconstruct the Roman theatre of Taraco. The incorporation of the theatre almost completes our model of ancient Taraco. We are only missing the port and the residential area. However, it is very difficult for us to learn about the residential city of Taraco, as the area it occupied in Roman times is now below modern Tarragona. When we walk through the residential and modern part of Tarragona, there are buildings whose unusual design attracts our attention. This building, for example, has the garage raised rather than underground as is usual. This design is not a whim. There's a very good reason for it. Here, below the building, are some of the remains of the residential part of Taraco. Remains that were found while preparing the land for building, and that the city council obliged the developers to preserve for future study. They are only foundations, but taken all together, they offer us a clear image. An image of how the residential part of Taraco was structured. Streets with pavements forming blocks based on an orthogonal grid. Now we can clearly see how the city was laid out. The main street crossed it transversely. The Forum in the heart of the city. In the upper part, the administrative zone, the circus, and outside the walls, the amphitheatre. Crowning it all was the worship area. And in the south, almost certainly, the port. A hypothetical port based on our knowledge of other cities, as we have yet to find the vestiges that will tell us what the ancient port of Taraco was really like. The final image of Taraco, it overwhelms and eclipses present-day Tarragona. We've come to the end of our episode. In this documentary, we've come to understand the importance of Roman cities for the success of the empire. We've seen the factors that determined where and how a Roman city was founded. And we have understood that the remains of many of these ancient cities are buried below some of our modern cities. We've witnessed the spectacle of interpreting the ancient remains of a Roman city, and we've compared them to a modern city. In this way, we've reconstructed the grand Roman theatre of Cartagonova. And the Grand Taraco. Taraco was a great city, but it shrinks in comparison to the larger cities of the empire. In the next episode, we will travel to some of these cities to see and understand many of the things that remain for us to see. The public baths, the Roman houses, the drainage systems, the territorial organization, Roman villas, and of course, the grandiose Rome. We will see you in the second part of Roman engineering, cities,